On January 6, 2021, throngs of protesters stormed the U.S. Capitol building intent on disrupting the certification of the presidential election. The crowd included seasoned militiamen and organized white power activists, Trump supporters with varying degrees of intensity of feeling and adherence to QAnon, a conspiracy that accused global elites of trafficking and murdering children. They breached the building, threatened lawmakers, carried zip ties, roamed the hallways, defaced offices, and scrawled "Murder the Media" on the edifice. 5 people died, including a police officer beaten by the crowd. As the action unfolded, journalists began to insist upon the word insurrection, not protest, to describe the day's violence. But many commentators, as well as policymakers and ordinary people, also voiced and repeated one reaction that quickly became its own myth. This is not who we are. Although in this case, it is an understandable, emotional reaction meant to decry anti-democratic violence, the notion that January 6th is not who we are is one manifestation of what has become a regularly deployed Republican Party and right-wing media strategy: to deny the workings of overt and violent racist activism even when those actions threaten American citizens and democracy itself. In the months that followed January 6th, this intentional denial became even more pronounced. One lawmaker, even as the New York Times assembled a long-form video piece that clipped footage together to depict multiple close brushes with violence on 1/6, called the insurrection a normal tourist visit. Another, while the House Select Committee tasked with investigating the attack began to subpoena witnesses, attempted to distort the very category of insurrection by calling the border policies of the Democratic Party a permanent election insurrection meant to replace white American voters. Trump administration officials and confidants at the time of this writing were preparing to refuse subpoenas, and the January 6th committee was filing contempt of Congress charges just to get testimony. In other words, the GOP, the right-wing media, and most Republican lawmakers did not condemn the events of January 6th, particularly in the long term. Furthermore, the very element that shocked so many that day, the presence of militant right and white power activists in propelling the violence, has been with us for decades, if not generations. January 6th is exactly who we are. As historians pointed out immediately, January 6th was American in the truest sense, its action hearkening all the way back to the founding of the United States, a moment that both built upon and produced deep and enduring legacies of violence, racism, and settler colonialism. Indeed, one can trace vigilante violence and lynching as foundational to American life and culture from the beginnings of the nation to the present. Such violence occurred not only in its most well-known incarnation, the spectacle lynching of Black men in the American South between 1890 and 1930, but in other places too. Mexicans and Mexican Americans faced vigilantes on the border in the early 20th century in stunning numbers. Women who refused to marry faced the possibility of lynching in the American West, as did union organizers in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Violence meant to seize and shore up power, a claim to sovereignty through the violence of the mob, is fundamentally American. The recent white power movement, however, is distinct in many ways from earlier mobilizations of racist and vigilante violence in American history. Here I'm talking about the broad and diverse social movement that brought together Klansmen, skinheads, neo-Nazis, militiamen, and more, beginning in the late 1970s. White power was bigger than simply another version of the Ku Klux Klan, which had already experienced 3 different eras after the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, and the war in Korea. By contrast, proponents of the white power movement were not really interested in seizing local power through mob violence. Instead, they advocated wholesale revolution through race war. By 2020, this organized groundswell represented the greatest domestic terrorism threat to the American homeland, according to both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. This was bigger, more dangerous, better armed, better organized, revolutionary, and endemic in every region of the country. How did we reach not only the crisis of January 6th, but also the repeated assertion that this is not who we are? The White Power movement convened a broad array of groups and people engaged in overt racism and violence. Indeed, it remains an incredibly diverse social movement in every way but race, uniting men, women, and children, people in every region of the country, felons and religious leaders, people in suburbs, rural areas and cities, high school dropouts, and people with advanced degrees, people across social classes and veterans, active duty military personnel, and civilians. When it formed in the late 1970s, it brought together several groups that had previously been at odds with one another, including Klan, neo-Nazi, radical tax resistor, Christian identity, white separatists, and later, skinheads and militia activists. These groups united with the explicit goal of waging war on the United States and its democratic institutions. Another historical myth provided the terms of the movement's unification, a shared narrative of the Vietnam War. By telling the story of betrayal by the government and failure of the state, white power activists mobilized both veterans and those who had not served. The loss of the war, in this powerful narrative, operationalized their violence and focused their anger and sense of betrayal on the federal government. Many of them traded white robes and hoods for camouflage fatigues and adopted the weapons and tactics of the Vietnam War. Here they followed a long pattern. The aftermath of warfare has been the most consistent predictor of such violence, more so than poverty, immigration, populism, or racial diversity throughout the recent past. Klan membership surges have aligned neatly with the aftermath of every major war in recent history. In the case of the Vietnam War, loss provided a particularly potent example, one that drew together a small number of veterans with many other disaffected people who felt betrayed by the government and sought radical change. These activists were motivated by a sense of urgency. They believed that immigration, feminism, abortion, interracial marriage, and other social changes would lower the white birth rate and lead to the end of the white race. In other words, they saw not a soft demographic transformation, the much-anticipated moment of transformation when a town, city, state, or nation would no longer be majority white, but an apocalyptic threat. Today, the same constellation of ideas goes by the label replacement theory, or the Great Replacement, and it has found purchase in mainstream politics and cable news commentary. The unifying event of the white power movement was the shooting of leftist protesters in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1979. There, neo-Nazis and Klansmen calling themselves the United Racist Front opened fire on a Death to the Klan rally, killing 5 people and injuring more. The 88-second shooting was captured by multiple news cameras on scene, clearly revealing what had happened. Heavily armed gunmen had fired into a crowd. A state trial of the Klan and Nazi gunmen featured an all-white jury, achieved through peremptory challenges, the dismissal of black jurors without cause, a vestige of white supremacist legal systems in the South that was eradicated in North Carolina shortly thereafter. The court acquitted every one of the Greensboro defendants. A federal trial similarly attempted to prove that the gunmen had deprived the victims of their civil rights by killing them, but specified that it was concerned with conspiracy to do so for reasons of race. But the victims in Greensboro had been 1 black woman and 4 men who appeared white, and the United Racist Front said it was there to kill communists, not black people. And because the long and complex regional relationship between anti-communism and racism, one documented at length by scores of historians, was ignored, the gunmen walked free yet again. Perhaps the most stunning is the finding of the later civil case in which the only death at Greensboro deemed wrongful was that of the one victim who was not a card-carrying communist at the time of his death. In any case, the white power movement opened fire on leftist protesters and killed 5 of them, and it did so with no real legal penalty because the city of Greensboro paid the damages in the civil case. The white power movement celebrated this victory and took it as a green light for further violence. The most pervasive misunderstandings of the white power movement come from the early 1980s, when its activists declared open war on the federal government and adopted an organizational strategy called leaderless resistance to achieve that goal. Simply put, this meant cell-style domestic terrorism in which white power activists could carry out individual or small group acts of violence on an agreed-upon set of targets with no demonstrable ties to other cells or group leadership. This strategy was designed to foil the government informants who had infiltrated the civil rights-era Ku Klux Klan and to make it more difficult to prosecute white power groups in both criminal and civil cases. Even trials like the one in Greensboro, a victory for the movement, had high personal and financial costs. At the time of the implementation of leaderless resistance, the Southern Poverty Law Center had succeeded in using civil cases to disband Klan paramilitary training camps, gag particular white power leaders, and prevent them from associating with one another, and even to seize the assets, membership lists, and headquarters of one Klan group. Although criminal cases broadly failed to return similarly decisive verdicts, they did cost the movement time and money. Leaderless resistance offered a solution to this problem. Leaderless resistance had a much more catastrophic outcome, however, one largely unanticipated even by white power adherents when it was implemented. It erased public understanding of white power activism as part of a movement, producing the most damaging myth about this history, that of the lone wolf. Let me be perfectly clear. There are crimes carried out by individuals. There are some mass shootings that are not motivated by politics. But there is no such thing as a lone wolf white power terrorist. The actions carried out by white power activists are part of a coordinated social movement, one that has united people in common purpose and around a coherent white supremacist ideology. They are legible events that require more than an individual response. Leaderless resistance did several things to change how the white power movement worked, ultimately letting it disappear from broad public understanding as a social movement. First, it disconnected rising membership numbers from rising levels of violent activism. In other words, the movement became less focused on mass demonstrations and emphasized targeted acts of violence. After it declared war on the United States in 1983, the white power movement wasn't looking for 6,000 people to march down Main Street. It was looking for 6 people willing to detonate a bomb. To be sure, the movement still used public actions to recruit and to disperse its ideology. But the violent center of its activity was not interested in large numbers as much as it was interested in total dedication. Therefore, from 1983 forward, falling membership in white power groups sometimes corresponded with rising levels of violent activism. One way that the white power movement implemented leaderless resistance was to go online. This is another misunderstanding reaching the level of cultural myth. People erroneously believe that the movement began to use the internet in the social media bonanza of the present moment, or even with the founding of the major white power website Stormfront in the mid-1990s. Instead, the white power movement pioneered proto-internet, web-based social network activism in 1983 through 1984, with the founding and implementation of LibertyNet. Using early computer networks, the white power movement set up a series of password-protected message boards where activists could access content. Their posts included not only hit lists and ideological screeds, but also personal ads and other social content. LibertyNet, in this sense, was an example of how social media could motivate network activism and spread misinformation and conspiracy theory decades before the invention of Facebook. The importance of LibertyNet was also evident in the resources and manpower devoted to its setup and implementation. As the historical archive shows, white power activists stole millions of dollars from department stores and armored cars in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California in the mid-1980s. They took this money around the country, distributing those funds to a network of white power groups with instructions to purchase Apple mini-computers. Then, a key movement leader traveled the same circuit, teaching people how to use the computers and the network. In a dispersed social movement that attempted to avoid keeping and revealing membership networks, the activity around LibertyNet illustrates the breadth and coordination of previously separate white power groups. LibertyNet also helped to operationalize the strategy of leaderless resistance by laying out a series of targets held in common between cells. Activists then pursued these targets with real-life acts of violence, including attempted assassinations, infrastructure attacks, the murder of federal judges and state troopers, bombings, and a cyanide attack on a public water supply. Leaderless resistance also allowed the movement to organize around differential levels of involvement. We might consider these in concentric circles. Scholars who have attempted to estimate the size of the movement in the 1980s broadly agree that the innermost circle would include only 25,000 people, but that this inner ring would be quite dedicated. Here we would find the people who live their full lives in the movement, marry other white power activists, raise their children in the movement, visit churches in the movement, and also attend to daily life, rides to and from the airport, homeschool curricula, recipe exchanges within the movement. These activists would also provide the pool from which to recruit leaderless resistance cell operatives. Outside this dedicated center, we would find another 150,000 to 175,000 activists. Those who attend public actions, subscribe to movement literature, and similar actions. Then, there is a larger circle of some 450,000 people who would not themselves subscribe to movement literature, but who regularly read that literature all the same. On January 6th, it was not just the inner circle who stormed the Capitol, but people from each of these rings, and a new one. Scholars little understand the circle of people just outside of that outer ring, which is much larger and somewhat more amorphous. That group includes the people who would never read a newspaper titled, for instance, White Aryan Resistance, but who might agree with some of the ideas and even the broader ideologies of white supremacy presented therein. This outer circle becomes critically important in an action like the January 6th insurrection. The concentric circle model of organization did two important things. It allowed activists who could be radicalized to be pulled to the center, and it pushed extremist ideas from the center into the mainstream, even beyond the outermost circle. The most notable example of the second impact from the pre-Trump years is the presidential campaign of former Klan leader and lifelong white power activist David Duke. Sociologist Sarah Diamond documents how some elements of Duke's presidential platform were deliberately adopted by populist primary challenger Patrick Buchanan and his by the Republican nominee George W. Bush, who was elected president. In other words, white power ideas percolated into mainstream politics far before the 2016 election of Donald J. Trump. The work of pulling people from casual membership to what both scholars and white power activists called hardcore activism happened in myriad ways. There were, perhaps, as many routes to radicalization as there were radical activists in the movement. So, too, did white power leadership in this period prioritize the recruitment of targeted populations, such as incarcerated people, veterans, and active duty troops, all of whom were thought to have operational and weapons expertise valuable to the movement. But it is difficult to overstate the importance of women in doing crucial radicalization work. Indeed, this reveals another durable myth: the idea that white power activism is a men's movement. To be sure, the movement used a paramilitary command structure and espoused anti-feminism, But the role of women was critical to its success, and the women who participated in it subscribed to this ideology and organization as well. Sociologist Kathleen Blee documents that across the 20th century, from the Ku Klux Klan to the White Power movement, women have done critical work in normalizing and mainstreaming such fringe groups, and in the social interactions used to recruit, radicalize, and bind white power activists. The historical archive of the White Power movement also bears this out. One might think of the Aryan Nations World Congress, the major summer summit that convened different groups in northern Idaho regularly in the 1980s. There, women were in charge of matchmaking schemes, social events, volleyball, and a big spaghetti dinner. Women's activism also provides a window into a period of white power activism that has largely been misunderstood. That of the bridge between the paramilitary movement of the 1980s and the militia movement of the early 1990s. Women's publications, auxiliary groups, homeschool curricula, fundraising, and coupon-sharing campaigns did not just persist but actually boomed in the period from the crest of paramilitary activism in the 1980s to the militia movement peak in the early 1990s. Because the militia movement represented a change in rhetoric, uniforms, and, to some extent, membership, some journalists and scholars have treated it as distinct from the earlier white power movement. This is a mistake. The militias, while anti-government, were not always overtly racist, but the white power movement's weapons, funds, and activists nevertheless flowed into militia groups. On a Venn diagram, we could think of a large circle representing the militia movement and a smaller circle of white power activism. Some militia groups and actions were not within the white power circle. However, the white power movement circle was almost entirely enclosed within the border circle of the militia movement in this period. The money, people, weapons, and energy of the 1980s white power war on the federal government flowed directly into militias. Furthermore, many militias unaffiliated with overt racism and white power violence marched shoulder to shoulder with groups that were affiliated. Both leaderless resistance and the opportunistic adoption of militia movement trappings were moves calculated to disguise the white power movement for what it was: a coordinated and socially networked movement of men and women that connected activists across multiple regions and different kinds of places in a violent war on the federal government, and in an attempt to attack democracy and provoke race war. It would be impossible to understand how a small number of activists thought they could wage revolution without the Turner Diaries, a novel that imagined the success of leaderless resistance. A central text and cultural lodestar for the movement, the Turner Diaries appeared at critical points and in the hands of important activists throughout its history. The White Patriot Party in North Carolina distributed it to new recruits in the mid-1980s. The Order, a white terrorist group in the Pacific Northwest, kept a stack of copies in the bunkhouse. Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh sold it on the gun show circuit in the early 1990s. The Turner Diaries, first printed in serial form in the late 1970s and then published as a paperback, was important not because of its quality, but because it answered a critical question. How could a fringe movement possibly hope to overthrow the most militarized superstate in the history of the world? The novel answers this question by laying out a series of strategies, beginning with cell-style terror, infrastructure attacks, and targeted assassinations, and rising to the theft and deployment of nuclear weapons and other mass casualty attacks. The Turner Diaries lays out the assassination of all race traitors on the Day of the Rope, and then, after the white power activists win, explains in a postscript the annihilation of all people of color throughout the United States and the world. The novel is unflinching in its violence, prescribing the use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, and describing the massive human cost of white nationalist warfare as collateral damage. It also illustrates an important problem with the phrase white nationalism in describing the movement. People may hear white nationalism and assume it to be adjacent with patriotism, or, at the very least, consider it as pro-American. But after 1983, the nation at the heart of white nationalism was not the United States, but rather the Aryan nation, imagined as a transnational polity of white people who would need to be saved from extermination through race war and violence. This is a fundamentally more violent and radical position than that implied by nationalism. The desire of the white power movement to disappear, the use of leaderless resistance, or cell-style terrorism, which prescribed denial of connection between groups and activists, and the rising tide of militia movement-era disaffection for the federal government set the scene for the explosion in Oklahoma City in 1995. So, too, did a disastrous attempt to prosecute 13 white power activists and leaders on federal charges, including seditious conspiracy in 1987 through 1988. That trial depended on plea bargains and investigative materials from several other prosecutions, all in an attempt to prove that the defendants had conspired together to violently overthrow the federal government. The archive here is quite clear. They said that's what they were doing, and they set out to do so on the model of the Turner Diaries. They were outfitted not only with the usual automatic and semi-automatic rifles, but also with anti-tank LAW rockets, homemade napalm, and claymore mines and machine guns. The Department of Justice, DOJ, had wiretaps showing the conspiracy, hundreds of calls between movement leaders and activists. But the trial was a disaster, with chain of custody problems obscuring the evidence, romantic relationships between two jurors and defendants, and a jury pool heavily sympathetic to the defendants. The DOJ had poured resources into the trial, but the headline it got at the conclusion was, "Jubilant Racists Win Trial." One of the main defendants, not contrite in the least, immediately started a quarterly titled The Seditionist. This embarrassing outcome was soon followed by standoffs at Ruby Ridge and Waco, where extremists died during government interventions, on live television in the case of Waco. Even as these events galvanized white power and militia activism, they tamped down government response. After the failure of the sedition trial, the FBI institutionalized a policy to pursue only individual actors in white power violence, with no attempts to tie individual crimes to a broader movement. This was the policy in place when Gulf War veteran Timothy McVeigh detonated a fertilizer bomb that destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The act belongs on a short list of atrocities. It was the largest deliberate mass casualty on American soil between the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that marked the U.S. entry into World War II and the terror attacks of September 11, 2001. We know the stories of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Those events have entered the realm of common knowledge. They are taught in schools and represented in pop culture, and many, if not most Americans, have at least a passing understanding of what happened on those days. Oklahoma City is different. Even as the nation marked the 25th anniversary of the attack that struck at America's heartland, slaughtering 168 people, including 19 young children in the building's daycare center, the nation lacked a coherent narrative of how the bombing happened, who perpetrated it, and what it stood for. From the beginning, and even more intensely perhaps, after the guilty verdict and his execution, our narratives of the Oklahoma City bombing have focused on McVeigh as a lone wolf. The evidence to the contrary is overwhelming. A simple social geography of McVeigh's life places him clearly within the white power movement. Indeed, the evidence of McVeigh's involvement in the white power movement is too extensive to document in full here, but a few highlights include his choice of a building that had been a movement target since the early 1980s, the use and distribution of movement novel The Turner Diaries in formulating his plan for the bombing, his presence as high-level security for movement leadership in the Michigan militia, his contacts and attempted contacts with the white power groups Arizona Patriots, National Alliance, and a white separatist compound at Elohim City, and the date of the bombing on the anniversary not only of the Waco siege, but of the execution date of a prominent white power activist who had once targeted, yes, the same federal building in Oklahoma City. Additional evidence abounds, and not at the level of conspiracy theory. He clearly subscribed to leaderless resistance. The Oklahoma City bombing did not reduce the violent ambitions of white power activists. Militia group membership and activity increased in its aftermath, and white power activists flocked to Stormfront, the newest platform for web-based activism following the model of LibertyNet. When the white power movement charged back into the limelight in recent years, it was not roundly condemned. In the aftermath of the violent Unite the Right rally and clashes in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017, President Donald Trump gave an infamous soundbite about there being very fine people on both sides. In his full comment, he makes clear that he is not referring to white nationalists and neo-Nazis as very fine people, and he says they should be condemned totally. The very fine people he refers to are an imagined group of innocent and peaceful protesters who wanted to protest the removal of a statue and name of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a public park. Trump's comment attempts to draw a bright line between neo-Nazis and white nationalists and the very fine people, even as it blames troublemakers on the left for starting the confrontation. The problem here is that the Unite the Right rally was not designed as a peaceful protest, but as a deliberate and paramilitarized white power action. It featured torchlit acts of intimidation and the killing of a counter-protester. It also featured militia groups that were purportedly present as neutral peacekeepers, but that in fact kept police from protecting counter-protesters because they were more heavily armed than the police. Trump's lack of condemnation would only become more and more pronounced. Even more concerning were deliberate attempts to distract from white power activism in the aftermath of mass attacks on American civilians, often with incontestable evidence about the motivation of the attackers. Several recent mass shootings carried out by white power attackers have been described in other ways. For this reason, we still read stories of lone wolf gunmen attacking Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand, Jewish people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Black Bible study worshipers in Charleston, Latinx people in El Paso. And these were acts of Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, and anti-immigrant violence. But they were also carried out by white power activists, all of whom shared the same core motivating texts, including the Turner Diaries, ideology, concerns about white reproduction, and list of targets. They are all part of the same movement. But a GOP talking points memo after the 2019 El Paso shooting suggested steering the conversation away from white nationalism to an argument that implies both sides are to blame. This stance not only ignored the threat of the most violent domestic terrorist movement attempting to attack American civilians, but deliberately tried to aid it in its work of disappearance. Here we see the evolution of the myth of "this is not who we are." The rising tide of white power activity and its overt, violent racism on the one hand, and the deepening disavowal and complicity of Republican elected officials and their media allies on the other. If the historical archive of the earlier white power movement offers us one lesson for today, it's this. The movement has used, and will continue to use, the myth of the lone wolf to attempt to evade open confrontation with public opinion. It will continue to claim that it is simply one person, a few people, a few feuding groups. But even as we see the newest iteration of this tactic, we are surely in the midst of a rising tide of white power violence. According to FBI Director Christopher Wray, 2019 was the deadliest year for domestic violent extremism since 1995, the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. Wray issued a similar statement when rates in 2020 and 2021 were even higher. This is a problem deeply intertwined in American politics and culture, and one that will require sustained attention to resolve. On January 6, 2021, the white power and militant right actors were, among the larger crowd, the most organized and well-armed, and they posed the greatest threat to the workings of democracy. So did January 6 follow the Turner Diaries, which features an attack on the Capitol meant as a show of force. And again, while much ink has been spilled trying to differentiate among groups such as the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, the Base, Boogaloo Boys, and Atomwaffen Division, all should be understood as part of the same broad white power and militant right groundswell, one with decades of organizing and resources and, today, with increasing momentum. On January 6th, when the insurrectionists constructed a gallows and noose outside of the Capitol, they referred directly to a scene in the Turner Diaries. The entire action referenced a strike on the Capitol in that novel. This indicates that January 6th was not meant as a mass casualty event, but a recruitment and radicalization exercise to draw others into the fold. Certainly, this happened immediately after the rally, as white power activists and others on the militant right reached into the Trump base and QAnon groups in intensified recruitment campaigns. Experts are quite clear on the danger we face. Political scientist Robert Pape has found that the outer circle of white power and militant right membership, where it connects to and overlaps with our mainstream politics, is growing at an alarming rate. Some 47 million American adults polled after the January 6th insurrection said that they believed the 2020 election was stolen and Joe Biden was an illegitimate president. Of those, 21 million said they agreed with the statement that the use of force is justified to restore Donald J. Trump to the presidency. Pape, who has studied political violence and civil unrest in other countries, recognizes a storm brewing in our own. All of this is, and remains, who we are. Knowing and understanding our history is the only path to a more democratic future.